and we're trying to find the small farmstead that was fortified. We know it's in the Beaver Dam Creek watershed, Wilkes County, Georgia, which is up in the Georgia Piedmont. The Battle of Carr's Fort took place on February 10th, 1779.
So the South has an incredibly important role to play in America's birth story.
This is the most staunch rebel stronghold in Georgia.
These folks, by and large, fought for liberty, fought for self-determination.
It was all over within about 6 hours.
No question that in the South, the war devolved into a very bloody civil war.
In the backcountry, it was a nasty affair. People were hiding behind trees and shooting rifles, and they were hitting their targets. The British didn't know quite what to make of this. They were still trying to figure out what's a rifle.
Washington, a small town nestled in the rolling foothills of East Georgia, has changed little in the more than 2 centuries since its founding. It's a place steeped in history, a heritage the city wears proudly. Washington was the first city in America named for our nation's first president, and it boasts more antebellum houses than any other locality in the state. Here the Confederate cabinet held its last meeting, on the run in the closing days of the Civil War. And here President Jefferson Davis famously disbursed the gold of the Confederate treasury. A decisive Revolutionary War engagement, the 1779 Battle of Kettle Creek, took place in the rugged backcountry nearby. But many Washingtonians are unaware of another historically significant clash just days earlier and a few short miles away, the Battle of Carr's Fort.
This area of Georgia was known as the Hornet's Nest. This was where it was a stronghold of patriots, people who were not loyal to King George and who were very strong of belief that America needed to be an independent place. So this is probably the most staunch rebel stronghold in Georgia.
The series of events that led to the Battle of Carr's Fort begins with the December 1778 capture of Savannah, when British troops took back control of Georgia's colonial capital from patriots who had ousted the royal governor just 2 years earlier. After the British seized Georgia's second city, Augusta, they used it as a base for a campaign to bring the entire colony back under royal control.
I prefer to look at things as campaigns. And the campaign to take Georgia started in 1778. And of course, as the rebel government took control, the royal governor, Wright, went back to England and some other top officials, and they're lobbying to get their province back because they think that there are many, many good loyalists there, they know there are, and that all they have to do is have a few British troops and raise the flag, and you'll be able to recruit all these provincial troops, all these locals, into military regiments with a little training, a little equipment, and a red coat, can take the colony back. And that was the plan that the governors from the southern states sold to the British Foreign Office.
But the southern royal governors had sold their superiors more than a bill of goods. This was a viable strategy calculated to help turn the war back in Britain's favor.
Well, the British were losing the war up north, so they decided to come down and beat up on the south. And their logic was they were going to land in Savannah and go seek volunteers in the upcountry, recruit loyalists for the war in the King's army, and then go back down and control the south. When they got up to the Augusta area, they realized it wasn't quite working out like they had hoped.
British hopes crashed hard against military realities in the Georgia backcountry in early 1779 in a series of engagements that included the February battles of Carr's Fort and Kettle Creek.
These battles were a couple of the few victories in this whole campaign around Kettle Creek. Was one of the few victories for the Patriots in Georgia during the Revolutionary War. There weren't many victories in Georgia for the Patriots.
Considered in tandem with other clashes in Georgia, these relatively small-scale battles underscore the often overlooked importance the Southern colonies played in the war.
It's our local war. It was here, and the world changed here. This is where the American Revolution was won. It wasn't won at Bunker Hill. It wasn't won at Lexington and the shot heard around the world. That's what started it. It was finished here in the South.
Carr's Fort was just one of at least 35 such rural log forts scattered throughout the Georgia backcountry. These crude fortifications were intended to provide protection from restive Native Americans in lands just ceded to the settlers by the tribes.
The fort is a stockade fort with a blockhouse. This frontier fort, people had kind of forgotten where it was. I mean, people knew where it was within a half a mile or so. But they didn't know exactly where the footprint of it was. And the story had been fairly lost. It hadn't been well told.
Carr's Fort was the fortified home of Captain Robert Carr, who commanded roughly 100 Patriot militia troops. In early February 1779, a group of about 80 Loyalist militia under the command of Captains John Hamilton and Dougald Campbell attacked the fort and overpowered its defenders. It was a short-lived British victory. Almost immediately, a larger Patriot militia force, numbering roughly 400 men and commanded by the legendary South Carolinian Andrew Pickens, caught up with the Loyalists and surrounded the fort. For the next several hours, the two opposing forces traded hundreds of rifle shots, resulting in the death or injury of more than a dozen men on each side. All indications were that Pickens' Patriots would soon either shoot their way into Carr's Fort or burn its Loyalist defenders out. Then came news that changed everything. A larger Loyalist force was headed this way.
Pickens gets word from his intelligence sources that coming across the Savannah River in force is Colonel Boyd. And see, he was after Colonel Boyd all the time. He really wasn't after John Hamilton. So he breaks the siege off and goes back and chases Boyd.
The Patriots caught wind of the fact that they were holed up in this fort known as Carr's Fort. And so the Patriots surrounded the place and got there just as they were shutting the door. And the 200 Loyalists were inside and the Patriots were outside getting ready to set fire to the place and blow it up with a cannon. When a person arrived from the east, from the Carolinas, telling them that there was a bigger group of Loyalists that were on the way from that area. So they called off the battle and they ran after these other guys.
It was an important tactical decision because if they had captured the 150 or so men in Carr's Fort, then they would have let Boyd with 500 to 700 men reinforce the British Army. And so Pickens made the right decision in our clear 2020 hindsight.
Pickens' snap decision to abandon the siege of Carr's Fort and instead go after Colonel John Boyd's larger Loyalist force was a fateful decision, one that would reap great rewards for the Patriot cause in Georgia and the entire South. 4 days later, the two small armies met up at Kettle Creek, just 3 miles away, resulting in a lopsided Patriot victory.
It's an interesting study in command because you have the proverbial bird in the hand, because there's no question that the South Carolina and Georgia militia would have ultimately won that battle and would have captured Captain Hamilton and all those troops that he had in there. They got a lot of his horses anyway, which were probably more valuable than capturing the soldiers. So in the grand scheme of things, that did not turn out to be all that important. But what was important is that Pickens made the command decision to leave this siege, to let those people go and go after Boyd. And he caught up with Boyd at Kettle Creek and was able to kill, wound, and capture over half of Boyd's soldiers.
In 2013, a group of battlefield archaeologists working for the highly esteemed LAMAR Institute in coastal Georgia set out to find the missing Carr's Fort battlefield. The The team had already discovered the scene of the larger Kettle Creek battle in the same area in 2008, and hopes were high that a second search would prove equally fruitful in connecting the dots in this important narrative. This expedition was funded by the National Park Service's Battlefield Protection Program grant, as well as the Kettle Creek Battlefield Association.
It's kind of an early reconnaissance effort. Nobody's ever found one of these forts. If we can find some tangible evidence of it, then we can tell the story of the people that were there, the lives that they lived, the way the things they had, their possessions, and just also the story of the actual battle itself, just the bullets. And
what Dan has done in Georgia is he's done the research in the archives and looking at the original source documents and tried to figure out on the ground where those places are. Dan Elliott is the finest military archaeologist that I've ever had the privilege of reading reports from and working with. The detail work that his team does is simply amazing. And so when the American Battlefield Protection Program looks at the results of their grants, I'm sure they, like me, know that this is an excellent, thorough, and detailed work.
Finding Carr's Fort after the passage of 2 and 1/3 centuries would be no easy task.
Basically, we're looking for a needle in a haystack. We're looking at about 7,000 acres, which is a pretty big area to find a little thing that's probably 40 or 50 yards across.
The work started with digging through archives to find first-person accounts of the battle.
We have a lot of descriptions by participants in the battle, most of which were written about 50 years later when they were filing for their pension applications. With the historical records, we've narrowed down to 3 or 4 likely scenarios.
Then it was time to back up the archival findings with truth on the ground. Each day, 6 to 8 people took metal detectors and spades in hand. To locate this 18th century battlefield, the LAMAR Institute used what is essentially 20th century technology, coupled with some 21st century know-how. The same techniques they utilized to locate the Kettle Creek site 5 years earlier.
And we're using the same tools that we use there, which is a systematic metal detector survey, covering the ground very evenly across the landscape. Once we find some targets, then we'll home in on it with other tools like ground-penetrating radar, shovels, and normal excavation. But the main tool of the trade for battlefield archaeology is the metal detector. And we've assembled some really cracked metal detector people who've had decades of experience using these tools.
Cast iron skillet.
We're laying a baseline for the site that we found so that we can dig systematic shovel testing and a kind of a cruciform pattern across the site.
Early sites like this are really rare. We hardly ever find them. And the reason is they didn't have much stuff. There's also a lot less people on the landscape.
We're going to dig at 10-meter intervals. So what we're hoping is for glass and ceramics, things that would not show up. Because a lot of those are fairly dateable. Also dishes and glassware. I also like to try to take just a little bit of dirt at a time, instead of digging out the entire hole, to take maybe 5 centimeters or so, layer by layer.
Almost immediately, the archaeologists began finding metal horseshoes, hundreds of them. Also, items of clothing worn by early Georgians, not necessarily related to the 1779 battle, but still important in telling the story of this place and the people who lived here.
Well, here's a button. That's the front of it. It's a pretty plain button. But the back, a lot of times, can be diagnostic. You can get a good date from it, and depending what the shank looked like. And this shank is almost all broken off. But it looks like it might have been a wire shank that attached like that, which would have been a good 18th century button.
Soon, however, other artifacts began turning up, items that indicated the team was getting closer to the site of the actual battle.
Lead ball?
I think so. Impacted.
It was the first musket ball found on the site, though many more would follow. Then, in March of 2014, weeks after they began digging, the LAMAR Institute team found definitive proof they were on the site of Carr's Fort.
We're inside Carr's fort, and I think I'm standing along one of the walls. There was a log palisade wall here. We think it's a wall for 3 reasons. We found musket balls that were impacting into the log wall. We found spikes from the wall. And then we did archaeological excavation and ground penetrating radar in this area that all indicated some kind of linear feature was in the ground here running across this section. We actually found the fort on the last day, the last hour of the day. We were coming, one of the crew members was coming up the hill back here metal detecting and stumbled on some musket balls, and that was a pretty good indicator something was happening in this location. It was a lot of work leading up to that point where we'd covered thousands of acres of metal detectors, and it was awfully rewarding to actually find the thing on the last day. My crew members came through at the last moment and found the fort, and then we were able to confirm it and establish this location on the landscape as a historical spot.
Once the location was verified and the searching done for the time being, it was time for Dan Elliott to take the artifacts back to his lab in Effingham County and begin drawing information from the findings.
The field work is just the first part. It's the easy part. The hard part is bringing it all back, cleaning it up, stabilizing the artifacts so they don't crumble away, and identifying things, and then writing the report and making the story come together. So really we spend about twice as much time in the lab and in writing the report as we do out in the woods.
Since the team found a large volume of artifacts at Carr's fort, it was important to decide which ones needed to come back to the lab and which ones should remain where they were found.
We found several thousand artifacts on our survey. A lot of those artifacts we identified in the field and left them there. We plotted their locations, particularly things like nails, things that we could identify readily and didn't really need to bring back to the lab. We left them there. We brought back all the diagnostic battle artifacts, and then we brought back enough representative examples from the other house sites and mills and farms in the area that give us an idea of early life in frontier Wilkes County, Georgia.
The site yielded many examples of the weapons and ammunition used by the militiamen on both sides of the battle.
This is hardware from an American or British flintlock rifle. This is the inside part. So showing the hardware, the mechanisms that make the gun fire. You pull the trigger, pull the cock back, pull the trigger, sets off the powder in the pan that sets off the powder in the barrel that sends the lead ball out the gun toward the intended victim. Yeah, this is what they had. They had a bunch of rifles, and these would have been made in the backwoods by expert gunsmiths. Each one was individually made, so they're not military issue. They're not standard British Army issue guns like a lot of battles have. These were more frontiersmen, and both sides would have had similar types of weapons, so it's hard to say whether this is from the American side or the Loyalist side.
In some cases, the bullets themselves reveal facts about what happened before they were left lying in the Georgia backcountry soil.
This is a dropped rifle ball. It probably wasn't fired. Here's a couple of examples of impacted rifle balls, ones that actually were fired and hit something. They're deformed, so they're not round anymore. And these would have been roughly round when they were stuffed down the barrel. And then when they fired, they go out the barrel and hit something. You can tell sometimes what they've hit. This one looks like it hit sort of a soft surface, maybe like the dirt. Others you can tell that they hit trees. In rare occasions you can see ones that hit human bone or cloth, that sort of thing, by the impressions that are left on this. This one looks like it's had a little more contortion. It hits either has been chewed after it was shot, or maybe a little more history to this one. I'm not quite sure.
These artifacts can talk, and the story they tell is an important one. It reminds us of the courage and resilience of ordinary Georgians who survived in an extraordinary time. Thanks to the efforts of the LAMAR Institute, that story is now illustrated more vividly than ever before.
The backcountry of Georgia and South Carolina were contested land during the Revolutionary War. The battle that took place at this particular spot was one of the most remembered battles by Colonel Andrew Pickens. He wrote a letter in 1811 and was recalling the action here. And to his mind, this was one of the most important victories that he had in the battle, or in the entire American Revolution. So it was a little bitty skirmish and a little out of the way spot, really, but it left its mark in the memories of the generals and the people that founded America.
Just as a team of dedicated archaeologists and researchers made discoveries on the ground in Wilkes County, another larger team made the entire project possible. Funding and support from the National Park Service and the Kettle Creek Battlefield Association were crucial to bringing the battlefield's location and its hidden stories to light.
The National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program, who funded most of this work, is extremely important for identifying battlefields in America that are not currently known or protected, and to bring them to the attention of the people so that the people can make their own decisions about how to protect these sites. This land is owned by private landowners, and they've been informed of the rich legacy that's on their property, and as you can see, it's in woodlands right now, and we're encouraging them to preserve it and not really alter it drastically. There's no immediate goal for any kind of park, but that might be an option later on. You know, there were at least 35 forts in Wilkes County from the Revolutionary War period. This is the first one that's actually been found archaeologically.
So finding these places, understanding what happened there, understanding the material culture of what's left there, trying to preserve those places for posterity, and then trying to build an interpretation program so people can go and understand what happened there is all part of what is supported by the American Battlefield Protection Program grants.
This project was an effort of lots of different people, including historians, land surveyors, just interested amateurs, and some pretty hardcore archaeologists who had decades and decades of experience. And we're very good at using the tools and the techniques to locate this site. So it would have been awfully hard to have found this without everybody working together.